Okay, so let's talk today about planning for grandchildren. Again, thinking about that because of the great time I'm having with Connor, my grandson, while we're up here, and work with a lot of clients who have interest in including grandchildren in their estate plans, whether it's primary gifts to the grandchildren or maybe it's only if parents don't survive. But the things I'm going to talk about this morning can apply to grandchildren, could apply to nieces, nephews, and in fact, minor children might be something that parents might be considering. So, one option, obviously, is to simply give your grandchild something during your lifetime. A number of clients are going to do that. They might have perhaps a significant ring or a significant item of personal property that they would want the grandchild to have as a memento of grandma and grandpa. So certainly something, if appropriate, you might consider giving to your grandchild during your lifetime. I'm a very big believer in giving things during our lifetimes if we are able to, rather than waiting till we die, because at least then we get to see the recipient of the gift enjoy it. Same thing to me applies if we're making charitable gifts to our churches. Why wait until after we die? If we have the ability to do it during our lifetime, do it then so the church can say thank you, or do it then so that the grandchild can express their appreciation and perhaps some explanation of the importance of the item that you happen to be giving them, a great opportunity to do that. Now, if you're going to wait until after death, what some clients are going to do is maybe they're going to leave that special item to the grandchild's parent with a request that the parent give that to the grandchild after their death. So in that case, you're expecting that the parent of the grandchild is going to receive that item at the time of your death and at an appropriate time pass it on to your grandchild. Perhaps your grandchild isn't old enough yet to appreciate it, and that might be a better alternative depending upon what sort of personal property you might be looking at giving. Sometimes clients are going to want to give a sum of money to their grandchildren, maybe a couple $1,000 or $15,000 or $25,000 or $100,000, doesn't really matter. But one arrangement that some clients are going to look at is maybe setting up just a separate bank account. Something simple, doesn't have to be very complicated. And maybe they're going to put the grandchild on as a joint owner. Now, I caution you, I've talked in previous seminars about the risks of joint ownership, but we're generally here talking about minor grandchildren. And oftentimes, if somebody's going to set up a bank account for a minor grandchild, they're not even going to tell them that they've done it. And the grandchild wouldn't even be old enough to know what it is anyhow. But you can set up a joint bank account. Put some money in it, maybe add money into it later. I know some grandparents that maybe annually are going to be contributing further gifts. But the idea, a joint bank account, and at the time of your death, it's now going to belong to the grandchild. Or perhaps you're going to make the grandchild simply a beneficiary on the bank account. So you already have an account set up, and rather than going through joint ownership, just put your grandchild on as a beneficiary so that at the time of your death, the proceeds will be received by the grandchild. Or perhaps you want to look at making the grandchild a beneficiary on a life insurance policy. Maybe you're going to get a new policy, or you've got an existing policy, and the idea is that you want to add the grandchild as a beneficiary of the policy so that they'll receive the proceeds at the time of your death. Or for some grandparents, we actually have grandparents that will have a life insurance policy itself that goes to the grandchild. So the life insurance policy is taken out in the grandparent's name, but then upon their death, the policy itself is now going to be owned by the grandchild. They're not receiving the benefit of the policy right away, but they're now going to have a policy of life insurance on their own life that might be important to them in later years, depending upon health issues and otherwise. I know in my family that was not an uncommon thing to see parents or grandparents to do something along those lines anyhow. Perhaps you have an IRA or a 401k, some sort of retirement plan, or maybe it's an annuity that you've got, or you might look at creating one, or traditional IRA, Roth IRA, all those different plans that people have by way of retirement funds anyhow. You can look at making your grandchild a beneficiary on that sort of plan. By doing that, if you're not familiar with it, you're going to be giving the grandchild perhaps some stretch options, as they call them, what they might sometimes you hear referred to as a stretch IRA. because the grandchild, unlike a spouse, is going to have certain options when it comes to required minimum distributions. And so, for example, if you had a 10-year-old grandchild today who maybe has a 70-year life expectancy, if they were the beneficiary on an IRA and you died and they were 10 years old, that IRA could essentially be stretched out over their lifetime, which could enable it to grow with minimum amounts having to be taken out over their lifetime. And so it can be a tremendous opportunity for the grandchild, something like that. Some clients, not unusual to find a lot of clients still with U.S. savings bonds, although they're becoming less and less part of someone's plan now that the government doesn't make them easy to get. It was much easier in the day when you actually went down to the bank and you bought a bond, and you had the piece of paper and it said a bond, and then you might put a grandchild's name on as a joint owner. I think the Department of Treasury might regret in the end when they got rid of the paper bonds, went to accounts, setting up accounts, managing accounts. They just don't have the same convenience perhaps as clients were looking for in the past, and the same feeling of a piece of paper with an account rather than simply some numbers on a monthly bank statement. But U.S. savings bonds still might be an option that you might consider looking at using for your grandchild. Now, all of these things that we just talked about, though, if you're going to leave them a sum of money in a bank account or perhaps life insurance proceeds or bonds or whatever it happens to be, we do have to stop to think about the possibility that if the amount is over $5,000, now very likely you're creating a situation in which a conservator is going to have to be appointed for your grandchild. So, for example, if your grandchild is a beneficiary on an IRA, and the amount in the IRA is more than $5,000, well, the manager of the IRA is not going to hand over 25, 30, 100, 200, 300,000, whatever it is, to your grandchild. If they're a minor, they are going to require that a conservator is appointed who's going to manage that money for the grandchild. And the same thing's going to apply if you've got significant dollars in a bank or, that you've made jointly owned, any of those situations. So now we have to think about that and ask ourselves, is that something that you want to do? Is it okay if you're creating a situation in which a conservator is going to have to be appointed? And if so, essentially, parent in all likelihood is going to be the one that's going to go to the probate court, probably get themselves set up as a conservator, but there will be some work that goes along with that before they're able to receive the gift, and then the conservator, rather than the grandchild, will receive the gift or the sum of money or the life insurance proceeds, whatever it happens to be, and will hold on to that and manage it until the grandchild turns 18. When the grandchild turns 18, the conservatorship's going to end, and all of the money or assets that are being managed by the conservator will have to be turned over to the grandchild at that time. But for some people, that's okay. They're not really worried about having a conservator. But for others, if you want to look at options that will allow you to avoid perhaps having a conservator appointed. So let's talk about some of those. One of those options could well be what's called a uniform transfer to minors account, an UTMA, used to be called an UGMA. It's now an UTMA, uniform transfer to minors account. And essentially the way that works is property. It could be a bank account, a stock brokerage account, could be real estate. Asset is given to a custodian. That's what they're called under the law. And the custodian's job, pursuant to the law and the documentation that's prepared, is to hold on to whatever it was that you gave them until the grandchild attains age 18. Although there is a provision in the statute where you could stretch that to age 21, but you have to specifically indicate in your documentation that it's until 21. So if you don't specifically indicate otherwise, it's going to be age 18. Otherwise, you can stretch it out till 21. But the idea is a custodian is simply going to hold on to this. There's not a conservator being appointed. The custodian is going to hold on to it, manage it. Oftentimes, the custodian is going to be a bank, credit union, a brokerage firm, something like that. Although, as I say, you can set up a UTMA account with real estate if you can find someone willing to manage it for them. And then when the grandchild gets to be 18 or gets to be 21, at that point in time, the asset is going to be turned over to the grandchild. Now, another consideration with an UTMA is that, according to Michigan law anyhow, the custodian can, if the custodian thinks it's appropriate, use the proceeds that are in that account to provide for the support of the minor until they obtain age 18 or 21 if you extend it that way. But it's kind of a simple way of doing things, doesn't require the appointment of a conservator, pretty straightforward. Oftentimes what that's going to amount to is simply putting the money away in a bank, and then when the grandchild gets to be 18, they'll go into the bank and they'll get their money. Now, you can set up the UTMA account now, or you could, by virtue of your will, if you've got an estate that's going to go through probate, or if you're going to have a living trust, you could direct your trustee to create the UTMA account at that time. So you don't have to create it now. It can be a direction to your personal representative or to your trustee to set up the UTMA account and put the proceeds, whatever the assets are, into that UTMA account. Now, one other consideration is if your grandchild dies before they receive the proceeds, then those proceeds are going to be distributed out as part of their estate. So there's not an alternate distribution plan there. So if you have an UTMA account set up for a grandchild and they don't survive long enough to take the money out, it's going to become part of their estate, and there might actually be the need now to probate an estate for the grandchild, depending upon how much money you've set aside in that UTMA account. But a lot of clients look at having UTMA accounts as kind of a somewhat simple way to go about and accomplishing their goals that they have for the grandchild. Now, another way that you can go about doing it is to have a trust. Perhaps you already have a living trust. And if you've listened to previous episodes of my show, you know I've talked about living trust and what they are and how they work, and considerations to think about when you're creating one, and what it means to fund your trust and the importance of funding your trust. But you could have a trust, and if it's your trust, you can include provisions in it, very common provisions included in someone's living trust for the grandchild. And the advantage of doing it in a trust format rather than that UTMA account is now you can tie it up beyond age 21. So let's say you want them to go to college. Well, you can have a trust or have a provision in your trust that's going to hold and manage whatever assets are in that trust for the grandchild, can be used perhaps to pay for their college education, pay for their support. But the idea being when they get to an age that you pick, and maybe it's going to be 25 or 30, or for some clients they might split it up, maybe half at 25, half at 30. You can be pretty much as creative as you want to be, but the idea being the trustee's going to manage it until such time as the grandchild gets to be that age that you've chosen, and then there will be distributions coming out of the trust directly to the grandchild. So trust can be a great planning opportunity for you, and again, it can be something that you are doing under an existing trust in your name, or some clients are going to set up a totally separate trust for the grandchild outside of their own trust, and it will be a separate trust that was just set up just to manage the assets that there might be for a grandchild. Again, you can designate in the trust what it's to be used for. Some clients will say it's only going to be used for college. Well, you need to think about that. If you're only going to use it for college, what if the grandchild doesn't go to college? Or what do you mean by college? Perhaps do you include trade school, technical schools? Some grandchildren aren't going to go get a 4-year college degree, but maybe they're going to become a welder, or they're going to become a beautician, or whatever it happens to be. So you need to think about those things when you're putting restrictions on it. How limiting do you want those restrictions to be, so that you're making sure that your wishes are being fulfilled in whatever it was that you had in mind in creating the trust provision for the grandchild in the first place. And again, having an ultimate distribution age. And then you need to think about, when you do that, what if the grandchild doesn't survive? What if they don't survive until the ultimate distribution? Now there's going to be proceeds there. What's going to happen with those proceeds? Perhaps you have other grandchildren and you're going to have it shift over to the other grandchildren. Or maybe if you don't have other grandchildren and you don't have other relatives that you want it to go to, maybe that's a point in time you're going to include some sort of a church or a charity. But you need to think about, what if my grandchild doesn't survive until full distribution? Another option, which I'm excited about for some clients anyhow, is is a 529 plan, and that's a plan and every state has a 529 plan. The idea is that you set up an account and you put a sum of money into that account, and then that money is going to grow tax deferred. So there's not going to be tax paid on it annually. And as long as the money is taken out of the account for qualifying cost of higher education, which is basically your tuition, room, and board situation, then it's going to be taken out tax-free. So you could set up a 529 plan for your grandchild. You could put funds in it. It's going to grow tax-free, and as long as it's taken out for a qualifying cost of higher education, it's going to come out tax-free. Great opportunities for college planning for your grandchildren. You can also front load the plan with 5 years worth of gifts. As you probably know, you can only give somebody $14,000 a year before you have to start thinking about gift tax consequences. Well, with a 529 plan, you can front load it with 5 years worth of gifts. So you could front load it with $70,000 to get started. You can't make gifts during the next 4 years after that anyhow, but you could start it with a significant contribution and allow it to grow over the years for your grandchild. Also, other advantages, you still control it. That means that you determine when the money is going to come out and what is appropriate for that money to be spent on. So it's not money that's just sitting there for your grandchild to do whatever they want to do with it. They have to come to you at the point in time when they're going to go to college, and you get to determine what the money's going to be spent for. So, for example, you could look at the grandchild and say, you know what, I'm not going to pay for you to go to that college down there in Ann Arbor that's got maize and blue and corn and something anyhow, but I will pay for you to go to a quality university such as Michigan State University or maybe a university in Notre Dame, but a premier college or university. That's what I'm going to pay for you to do. So you still control the proceeds. Also, if your grandchild doesn't go to college or they don't go to the college that you want them to go to, you can shift the money to another grandchild. So you could take the grandchild who wants to go to that college in Ann Arbor and say, hey, if you're really going to go there, sorry, Grandma and Grandpa aren't going to support that endeavor, and I'm going to move that over to your sister, who is going to go to a more appropriate school, such as Michigan State University. So you're still in control of the proceeds. So even though you've given it away, you're still in control of it. Also, if need be down the road, you can take it back. So let's say you don't spend it, or you don't spend all of it, or something happens to your grandchild and they don't go to college. You can take it back. Now, when you do take it back, you're going to pay a penalty on it, and you're going to pay interest on the income that it's generated, but it is an opportunity where you know that under any circumstances, you're still controlling it. And what you really do is when you set up the account, you normally set up a successor, someone who's going to manage it if something happens to you. So it's a great tax vehicle. Before we had 529 plans, we would have to do an educational trust for grandparents who want to do something like that, but they were not as favored tax-wise as the 529 plans. I'm a big believer in 529 plans. The other thing that you're doing, if you're in an estate situation where maybe you have a federal estate tax problem, putting the money into a 529 plan, it takes it out of your estate, so it shrinks the size of your estate. And you can set up 529 plans for as many people as you want to set them up for. You're not limited to only one or two grandchildren. So there's a lot of planning opportunities that you have with a 529 plan. Every state has an approved 529 plan. Michigan has a 529 plan. And the real difference from state to state, if you start looking at them, oftentimes a state might give you some sort of tax advantage for setting up the 529 plan in that state. So for example, in Michigan, if you're a Michigan resident and you're paying Michigan income taxes, you will be able to get a deduction on your Michigan return for money that you put into the Michigan 529 plan. But you need to look at that. You also need to look at investment options because different plans in different states are going to have different investment options. So if you look at the state of Michigan plan, they're going to give you certain options. It's not as though you're going to select, I want to have Coca-Cola stock or any of that stuff. It's going to give you certain investment options, which are going to be along the lines of mutual funds, but that's what's going to happen with the state of Michigan. Now, if you're interested in the state of Michigan plan, you will find that at misaves.gov. A lot of information there, and that's where you can set yourself up. You can do it all online, invest it online, get the account all set up to go. Now, some of you might be familiar with the MET program in Michigan, which is the Michigan Educational Trust, where you're prepaying a full 4-year degree or 2-year degree. That's a different program than the MI Saves program, but it is still a program that's available in Michigan. And the MET program, the Michigan Educational Trust, really is a prepaid 529 plan. So you're prepaying the entire college education for the grandchild rather than simply putting money into an account that you're going to be controlling later on. That MET account, if you're familiar with it, it is refundable and you can transfer it to siblings or first cousins. But I think you have perhaps some better options if you're going to look at the standard 529 plan that the state of Michigan is going to give you. Now, if you look at that too, what a lot of clients are going to do is they're going to take the 529 plan and they'll set it up inside a trust. So it's the trustee who's going to manage the 529 plan, just like they're going to manage a bank account or something else. And by doing that, what you've accomplished is if you die, your successor trustee that you've already named in your trust is going to have the ability to manage that plan for you. So there's already a structure in place to take care of that plan at the time of your death. And one other thing, several years ago, Michigan changed its probate code, to allow what is sometimes referred to as a dynasty trust. Now we're getting to some higher end planning for wealthy folks and grandchildren, but a dynasty trust is one that never ends. It used to be that trusts had to end after a certain period of time. Well, in Michigan, they don't, unless they have real estate in them. But if they don't have real estate in them, they can effectively last forever. So what some clients look at is they say, well, what if I create a dynasty trust? I fund it with some significant initial contributions for the 529 plan, put that $70,000. So maybe you've got a 6-month-old grandchild and you're setting up the 529 plan, you're putting 70 grand into it. Well, by the time that grandchild gets to be college with appropriate investment, the amount in that account should well exceed what it's going to cost for the grandchild to go to college. Well, what happens with the dynasty trust is when that grandchild finishes college, now the amount of money that's left in the 529 plan gets shifted to another grandchild, or perhaps to that grandchild's children. And if you thought about that, you can go to grandchild, to the grandchild's children, to the grandchild's children's children, etc. And you can set up a multi-generational educational program that, again, is all tax-free. So there's some great college planning opportunities by combining that 529 plan with the dynasty trust if you are in that situation anyhow. So lots of different options that you might look at in taking care of your grandchildren. And again, the different options that we talked about could apply to minor children, could apply to nieces and nephews as well. But just trying to give you some ideas today on options for including your grandchildren in your estate plan.